Were there any written questions? Okay, why don't you just go ahead then and take some general questions from the audience. Have a discussion for, 15 or 20 minutes or so. Again, this is, what it's about. I mean, we can talk about these maps and Seville-Rise, but, it's ultimately about protecting people and communities. And here we have representatives of some of the most impacted communities. So why don't we go ahead? Yes, Cameron, my good colleague from UNH.
I was really interested in the end, the first point I heard about regional responses. We sort of heard about Cambridge, we heard about Boston, we've heard about Chelsea, and I'm wondering, I'd like to hear from all three of you and how you envision moving from sort of these initial steps you're taking in your communities to really develop a more regional response, because when it happens, it's not going to be any one community, it's going to be, right, all of them.
I can start. Not sure if this is on, but it's on. Yeah, so in Cambridge, going into this, we were very cognizant of the fact that we're not an island. We can't just protect ourselves, and we're also very reliant on a lot of regional systems. So we're trying to understand our vulnerabilities and what we can do about them ourselves, but we also want the vulnerability assessment to highlight our regional connections. So obviously we have things like the MBTA that the whole region is reliant on. So for instance, if it could be that Cambridge is fine during some flooding event, but that flooding event affects the Red Line in Boston and shuts it down. Well, that's going to have a major economic impact on us. You saw in Kirk's presentation the problem which we recognized before we even started doing AdCirc, that not only could storm surge flooding possibly go over the top of the dam, but it might go around the dam. And in fact, that may be the more problematic issue for us. But the path for that storm surge flooding starts in Boston and at least 2 points. And so obviously we would have to work with Boston and probably the state to address any measures. And similarly with the electric grid, our natural gas, our primary heating fuel, and also runs of power plants and so forth, that all comes in from outside. And so we have to be very cognizant of our vulnerabilities related to that.
I think John put it very well about having to work with the regional agencies. Obviously, the rivers that border Chelsea are not entirely within the city. They are, we border with Revere and with East Boston and with Everett. And so we'd have to address on a larger scale the impacts that are going to affect Chelsea. We've just recently, and John Barros didn't mention it, but we just recently started to, the planning directors in the region have started working together to start talking about issues. Just started, so we're not very far with it, but it's something that can lead to further development. We also have a regional planning agency that is very good at what they do and is very good at helping its member communities do future planning, so we can count on that agency as well.
I guess for me it comes down to we need to change our attitudes about how we look at things, and because I might not live near the water and it doesn't affect me, it certainly does affect you. All the trucks who bring food and produce to airport to be shipped out, they run through Chelsea. So if we decided to block those roads and not let those trucks and everything not have access to the airport, how would we eat? How will we survive? So we need to look at, what happened up in Newburyport with some of the houses falling into the sea. And this is some real serious stuff, and we need some people to step up and take some responsibility and lead us in a way that we need to be led.
Okay, next question. It's up there. Yes.
We're working on sustainability planning there. I'm just wondering, on a local level, where do you get the resources
From the city of Chelsea, we don't have mapping capabilities, so we liberally borrow a lot of what we see going around in the print or online. As far as other resources, I think I mentioned earlier that we're now working with Sea Grant and with Worcester Polytech. We have a very good history of working with, taking advantage of the colleges around the area and getting a lot of help from students doing their charrettes and their planning classes. So we take a lot of advantage of that. Other than that, it's going to have to be the state or federal funds, because local funds are not going to be able to address this.
In Cambridge, I mean, we're fortunate, we have a pretty vibrant economy here. So the city has a very good GIS system, and we've built up a lot of information over the years, but we've also taken advantage of sort of other, low-cost opportunities. So for instance, we have an urban forest canopy layer that we did a couple years ago with the University of Vermont. They have a spatial analysis lab up there, and for pretty short money, they use LiDAR data to basically map out the extent of the tree canopy in Cambridge, which turned out to be about 30%, which was more than I thought it was going to be. And we're now using that information along with other information in our assessment. And as I mentioned with the AdCirc modeling, we probably wouldn't have done that except that the state was doing it and we had the opportunity to piggyback on it. In Massachusetts, of course, the Mass GIS has a lot of very good data that can be used at the local level. So I think there are opportunities to get the information you need to at least start to plan.
Another question? Yeah. Yes, up there.
Yes.
Of climate impacts in Chelsea and in Cambridge. And I wanted to ask further about civic engagement in climate adaptation planning in Chelsea. For example, we heard about the process for the vulnerability plan in Cambridge and how different stakeholders are involved. One example might be the urban canopy, the tree planting going on in Chelsea right now. Given that Chelsea is an environmental justice community, what sort of response and engagement have you seen from civic groups or citizens groups or other constituents? Thank you.
Pretty much on a hold. We have a very active environmental activists within our community who have brought a lot of issues to city government, to John as a planner, and we have worked collectively to try to address some of those concerns. People in the community are very active in coming to meetings and sharing what those concerns are, which in turn we're able to try to put together a plan. That's why John's here, and we rely on John for a lot of things.
The council is correct. We have a very active community groups involved in environmental issues and actually are participating with us as part of the planning effort for these tree plantings. We also, on a regular basis, whenever we do other studies, one of the other things that the council did mention on the list of things was we just recently worked with the EPA to review our ordinances to try to green them, and that we used a advisory board, including residents as well as the environmental activists.
And I'd mention with businesses, I think a lot of businesses are motivated already to be concerned about this. A lot of businesses, especially the larger ones, have business continuity plans because they worry about disruptions. And Hubert Murray from Partners is working a lot with his firm to think about these kinds of things. And we hear about that with life science firms in Cambridge that have very expensive research going on they can't really afford to go down. And we saw in Hurricane Sandy that a lot of expensive research got lost in the flooding, and we don't want that kind of thing to happen here. So it's not so hard to have that conversation with a lot of businesses because they understand that that's very tangible.
Ellen, over here.
Oh, thank
Thank you. Okay, hi. I was actually lucky enough to be one of the student groups that has worked with the City of Chelsea last semester, and I'm really interested in hearing the comments today on, I guess this kind of goes back to Joyce's point before about Chelsea being an environmental justice community, and I know that you don't have the solutions, but I'm interested in hearing what you would like to see in terms of kind of the intersection of social justice and storm surge and, you know, flood mitigation. What your ideal situation would look like.
Sorry, I don't.
You don't know.
No.
I guess just trying to stay active and trying to get ahead of the curve and working with various groups to address these issues. I think that's the best way I can put it to you.
I have a question regarding who's going to be responsible for the tank farms, the Shell or the tank farms? Who will be responsible for maintaining those in the case of a flood? And then if I could also, I was wondering about Seabrook with Cameron over there, if he could answer that one, but not yet.
The tank farms are doing their own planning right now. They're doing a lot of reinforcement of their waterfronts, primarily barriers, steel walls or revetments, and riprap. It's primarily them doing the planning for themselves at this point. Once we start doing more adaptation planning, we're obviously going to have to include them in the city's plan as well.
I have a mic. I guess I'll go ahead quickly. Councillor Robinson, thank you so much for demonstrating the difference between radio and television. Radio is like television, but with better pictures. So without a single slide or map, you illustrated not only climate change, but most of American cities' relationship with their water. My question to all three of you is, do you have other models domestically or internationally that you see are doing great things or that you've foresee partnerships with? Thank you.
Well, I think we're very early in this era of planning for climate change. We don't see a lot of examples out there. There's certainly some. New York City's obviously doing a lot of good work. We see work going on Boston, cities like London and Copenhagen abroad. But it's really just starting to get going, and even this professional practice of being an adaptation planner is starting just now to emerge. So for right now, I think you kind of have to look at your own situation and take stock of what the risks are and figure out how to go about doing something about it. There's not a lot of precedent really to follow.
I think the council mentioned barriers, and I'm actually kind of interested in those as well. I know London has done it, and Denmark's Copenhagen has done it. And several years ago, a local architect, regional architect, has presented a model for a regional barrier in Boston Harbor. Don't know whether it's practical or not, but I think it's something that I'd like to take a look at.
I think we probably should be looking at our building codes to see whether or not we can address some of those issues through the building codes of all the new development that's going to be taking place, that they address the issue of the rising sea levels while they're building these buildings.
Yes?
I think this sort of follows on from the last question, but it sounds, I'm pleased to know that you've done, both cities have moved forward. I'm curious if you could list just one or two things that have gone smoothly, more smoothly than maybe you expected, and then a few things that are roadblocks that you need help with, that kind of thing.
Smoothly.
Well, nothing ever really goes smoothly.
I was just going to say that. Nothing goes smoothly in local government. Roadblocks we could talk about. Roadblocks are lack of funding, not only just planning, but also actual construction. Roadblocks are lack of education. I mean, yes, there's been a lot of talk about climate change, but there's still that controversy. It's still not something everybody wants to talk about just yet. And then it's finding a place in the local budget, the local municipal budget, to put that in and find the resources that you need.
I mean, in some ways, I think a lot of things have gone smoothly, and there's been some serendipity in our project. So just the fact that we're doing the vulnerability assessment went much more smoothly. As I mentioned, our advisory committee made a recommendation to the city manager, and he readily accepted that. There wasn't much debate over it, and gave us a budget to work with, which we've blown through a couple times, and that's gone smoothly too, and now some more money has come. So that went well, and I should mention we used that graphic, that initial graphic of storm surge flooding in Cambridge in the recommendation to graphically represent what the risk was, and I personally think that made a big impression, because just as Paul said, when he presented that to the advisory committee originally, it was sort of like, stunned silence, and I think that had the similar effect when it went up to City Hall. So I'd say get good graphics. And then other things happen along the way. After we started the assessment, as I mentioned, it was just a couple weeks before Sandy hit, and not that I wish Sandy had hit, but the fact that it happened really accelerated things. It really opened up a lot of eyes and made people much more willing to work with us on this, and understood how important it was. We didn't have to prove anything to anybody. And so that was very serendipitous. And then being able to piggyback on the state's AdCirc model, which was, I don't think we even had heard of AdCirc before. And so that came up, and the state was very open to letting us do that. So those kinds of things have gone smoothly. Other things, not so much. We, for instance, have the utility NSTAR on our advisory committee, hoping we would get information about our electric system from them, but because of the Patriot Act and other issues, they have not been willing to hand over any data. So for instance, we've mapped out all the substations in Cambridge, but that came out of our assessor's records, not from NSTAR. And they're willing to talk to us about it, but they're not providing us any information up front. And similar experience with Verizon, because they have similar issues. So things of that sort of so there have been difficulties of that sort.
Building on the idea of serendipity, two things that I found actually helpful for us was the fact that FEMA is promoting new maps. It's been it's been out in the public, and that has increased some awareness of the issues and some willingness of people to actually help us and work toward it. The other one was, and I'll give a plug to Sea Grant again, being able to find students who want to work on this type of thing, and who have responded with an excellent proposal. Those two things have worked very smoothly for us.
Actually, I have one question myself. I'm almost optimistic. I mean, we've had 4 cities, if you include Boston, seriously talking about impacts and adaptation and wanting to take action. You've found a couple of barriers, but you all seem to want to move forward with them. Am I right in feeling optimistic? I mean, I know also, the Regents hospitals are interested in it. Some of the universities are, private developers are. I mean, I think the region's going to be able to adapt successfully to climate change?
Well, I think that the issue of preparing for climate change is a much more tangible thing. It's easier for people to relate to and be willing to do something compared to dealing with the issue of reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And so there's an advantage there. And we do see people doing. Harvard has a adaptation working group at work now. I'm not sure exactly what's going on at MIT, but I'm sure there's some planning going on there. Some of the businesses are very concerned about, we have a sustainability compact in Cambridge that involves the city, MIT, Harvard, and most of the major employers, and they've also identified preparing for climate change as a key issue that we'll collaborate on. And I recently went to the first regional conference on preparing for climate change at the local level that Cameron was actually the keynote at. It was in Manchester, and there were about 400 people at that meeting. And that followed the National Adaptation Forum last year that was also the first one that had about 500 people at it. So this is something I think people really relate to and get and know that we need to do something about.
I think the issue, though, is it's long-term, and it's not going to be something that's very visible once you start doing it. Unlike if you have a bad intersection where you have a lot of accidents, you know, in a month you put up a traffic signal, the accidents stop, it's very visible. This is not something you're going to see like this. It's going to be something that's going to take a long time for people to see the effects of it, and over long term they may not equate it with what you've done in order to prevent it. So I think that has, I guess that's a little bit of another roadblock or something that you kind of work with. But that doesn't mean I'm not optimistic. I mean, this is something that we need to work toward, and I think people are getting comfortable with the idea.
Yeah, just that we're here and we're having dialogue about it, I think that's one of the baby steps that we have to take and figure out what the next steps are to be able to achieve the goal, to be able to address the concern about the rising sea level.
Okay. So maybe, one last question. Anyone? Oh, yeah, go ahead.
You had mentioned Hurricane Katrina and how the environmental justice issues that happened with the hurricane response there. And then you also mentioned how Chelsea also has some environmental justice issues. How is the adaptation work you're doing now or planning to do, ensuring that these inequalities that have happened in the past with regards to adaptation aren't going to happen again with both Chelsea and Cambridge?
Good question. Well, I think over the years, we have been addressing those issues and trying to address those concerns. We do have a very large poor population who live pretty close to the water. And by us having a very aggressive building code enforcement to make sure that the buildings are up to code, that's one of the ways that we're looking at trying to put a dent in dealing with some of those issues and the rising of the sea levels.
At the same time, as the council had indicated, a lot of people didn't realize that Chelsea had a waterfront. And we're trying to work with the neighborhoods to extend that neighborhoods into the waterfront. Sea level rise may make it a little bit easier as the waterfront's going to be coming to them. But and as the council indicated, also we have one of the neighborhoods I pointed at on the southwest corner of the map was called the Bellingham neighborhood. It's our highest rate of, it's the lowest income, highest rate of minorities, and most dense neighborhood, and it's also the area that will be affected by sea level rise. The question is, how do we address that area in such a way that we don't exacerbate the issues that are already there? I don't have the answer yet.
I mean, I think that's why it's in part important to do a thorough assessment of what your vulnerabilities are, because the impacts, as you already see from the maps, don't happen uniformly over the community. So we're already seeing in our mapping that urban heat island affects certain parts of the community more than others, and when you understand that relative to where vulnerable populations live, then it helps you target your efforts to protect those vulnerable populations. Same thing with flooding and so forth. So I think it's really important to understand your vulnerabilities in your community in a very as specific a way as you can. I'm not suggesting everyone needs to do it the way we're doing it, but I think there are different degrees to which you can do that. So.
Okay, well, it's 5 o'clock. First of all, I want to thank the panel. I want to thank the audience. And also, I want to thank Judy Peterson, who really pulled together a great program here. She's, its first day has been very successful. The next 2 days, I'm sure, will also be equally successful. So again, thank you to the panel, and thank you to Judy. Thank you.